Have you ever wondered, looking at the majestic walls of Carnarvon or the Tower of London, at what cost these giants were built? We are talking about monstrous, inhuman labor, about sweat, blood, broken bones, and lives sacrificed for the foundations of these stone structures. Today, when we can lift hundreds of tons of steel kilometers into the air and build a city in a couple of years, it seems to us that even then, technology worked wonders. But that's not the case. A medieval castle is not just a fortress. It is a monument to human perseverance, ingenuity, and, let's be honest, ruthlessness. It is a symbol of what people are willing to do for power, security, and status. Could we, with our iPhones, neural networks, and nanotechnology, build something similar today if we were without our beloved cranes, excavators, and even basic electronics? I think many of us would give up after digging the first meter of a trench. So, were medieval builders superhumans? Or were their technologies so ingenious that we still cannot understand all their secrets? Let's dig deeper. We'll tell you 10 facts that will make you look at every stone in the walls of medieval castles in a whole new light. And believe me, it will be much more interesting than any fairy tale. Ready? Today you pay for building materials with money. But in the Middle Ages, do you think gold and silver ruled everything? Wrong. Very often, stone itself was a form of payment, and a much more reliable one than shiny coins. Funny, isn't it, when the means of production itself becomes a means of exchange? Kings and lords, especially during periods of acute cash shortages, which happened constantly due to wars, epidemics, and general economic instability, invented remarkable methods of payment. One such method was to grant the right to extract stone from their own specially designated quarries. This was not simply taking stone, it was a fully fledged economic tool. For example, an abbey or a wealthy merchant, in return for a service rendered to the king, such as providing a loan or supplying the army, could receive as compensation not a bag of coins, but an official stone grant. The right to use a certain amount or to continuously extract stone from a particularly valuable quarry under royal control. Such grants were carefully documented and could sometimes be inherited or even sold, essentially becoming the equivalent of securities. An example is the famous Portland stone, highly prized in England for its strength and aesthetic appearance. Access to the quarries on the island of Portland, off the coast of Dorset, was strictly controlled by the crown. Only a select few were granted the right to quarry there. Often, monasteries, which were major builders and had their own workshops, could obtain such stone grants for the construction of their own cathedrals or monastery complexes. In return, they could provide the king with various services, from prayers for his well-being to supplying provisions or even providing their own highly skilled stonemasons for royal projects. It was a complex system of barter and mutual obligations, where stone played the role of hard currency, whose value was not subject to inflation and could not be stolen as easily as gold. Moreover, valuable stone types, such as white limestone from Caen in France, were the subject of international trade, and transporting them across the English Channel for use in the most prestigious buildings, including parts of the Tower of London, was a complex logistical operation. Caen stone was not just a material, it was a symbol of status and power, an indication that the client could afford not only to build a magnificent building, but also to import the best materials from abroad. In this case, you are not paying for the delivery of the stone itself, but for the exclusive right to purchase and transport it, which made it even more valuable. Imagine if today, instead of money, you paid for services with bricks, and the rarest and most beautiful bricks could only be obtained with special permission from the government. This shows how deeply the value of materials was woven into the economic and social structure of medieval society. Stone was not just a building material, it was a solid asset, a strategic resource that could be a gift, a form of payment, a symbol of power, and a sign of favor. And that makes you wonder, what is our stone as currency today? Our most reliable investment that is not subject to inflation and market whims? Probably something that cannot simply be picked up and transported on a cart. We talk about the romance of the Middle Ages, about knights and ladies, but imagine the smell of a medieval castle construction site. No, it wasn't the scent of fresh wood or lime mortar. It was the unbearable, constant smell of human and animal excrement. Shocking? But it wasn't just unsanitary, it was part of the process. This aroma was an integral part of the working day of a medieval builder, and its source was not accidental. The fact is that, in addition to lime and sand, organic additives were very often used as one of the most important components of mortar, which today cause, to put it mildly, surprise. We are talking about manure, urine, and sometimes other biological waste. Yes, you heard right. This was not just an old-fashioned method, but a completely rational approach to improving the properties of building mixtures, given the knowledge of the time. Why did it work? Of course, the science of the time did not know about chemical reactions at the molecular level, but trial and error led to some amazing discoveries. The organic substances contained in manure and urine, in particular ammonia, proteins, collagen, keratin, and fatty acids, reacted in a complex way with calcium hydroxide, slaked lime. This process led to the formation of calcium soaps and other organic compounds that acted as primitive plasticizers and water repellents. In simple terms, the solution became more plastic, easier to apply, better at filling gaps, less brittle after drying, and, critically, more waterproof. This was particularly important for protecting walls from moisture and frost, which significantly extended the service life of the structure. Some sources even indicate the use of animal blood, often bovine, which was added to the mortar. The proteins contained in blood, especially fibrin, interacted with lime to create even stronger and more elastic bonds, giving the mortar additional binding power and resistance to external influences. This hellish cocktail was a true medieval concrete, albeit with a very specific smell. The workers who mixed these components by hand in large vats or directly on the ground breathed in this smell day after day, which certainly did not contribute to their health. Constant inhalation of ammonia vapors and organic fumes led to lung problems, irritation of the mucous membranes, and other diseases. It was one of those secret ingredients that were not advertised, but without which the castle might not have stood for centuries. Historical chronicles do not mention it because it was part of the dirty work that was not considered noble and was not intended for public discussion. However, archaeological and chemical analyses of samples of medieval mortar regularly confirm the presence of organic impurities. This is probably why many buildings have survived to this day. They were held together not only by stone, but also by, well, you know what, ensuring their remarkable durability in a harsh climate and without modern technology. Do you think modern builders could work in such conditions, knowing that their cement is literally made from waste products? Perhaps this makes us appreciate our modern materials and hygiene standards, but also admire the ingenuity and perhaps desperation of those who built these masterpieces. This fact clearly demonstrates that the Middle Ages did not shy away from any means to achieve monumental goals. You build a castle, investing all your money in the lives of several generations. You think it's yours? Well, it's not. In England, there was a practice whereby the king could requisition or even expropriate a castle from the lord who built it. This is no joke. You sweated, risked your life, went bankrupt, and suddenly your property became the king's. Why did this happen? The king was the supreme suzerain, and under feudal law, all land and therefore all buildings on it ultimately belonged to the crown. Lords owned land only as feudal tenure, received from the king in exchange for military service, vassalage, and other obligations. This meant that your right to own property was not absolute but conditional. If a lord lost the trust of the crown, became too powerful, threatening the central authority of the king, or simply could not effectively govern his territory and ensure security, for example, due to internal strife or inability to resist external enemies, the castle could be seized. This often happened after rebellions, conflicts with the crown, or during wars, when strategically important castles located on borders or key trade routes came under direct royal control. For example, after the Barons' Wars or the Welsh rebellions, captured castles were not returned to their former owners, but were fortified and administered by royal constables. There were various forms of such requisitioning, confiscation, forfeiture. If a lord was found guilty of rebellion or treason, his lands and castles could be completely confiscated by the crown. This was the most severe punishment, and the lord lost everything. Seizure. In the event of a threat or instability, the king could temporarily seize a castle by placing his own garrison there. Formally, the castle remained the property of the lord, but in reality, he could not dispose of it. Royal officials monitored its condition and could even carry out their own fortification work at the lord's expense. Ransom. Sometimes the lord was offered a ransom for his own castle in order to regain control of it, but the amount could be exorbitant. A striking example is the fate of many baronial castles during the reign of King John Lackland, and subsequent periods. John, known for his tyranny and desire for absolute power, often used the confiscation of castles as a means of exerting pressure on his barons. If a baron was unable to pay a huge fine or tax, his castle could simply be taken away. Another telling example is Chepstow Castle. Although it was built by the powerful Marshall family, it regularly passed from the crown to other influential families for various reasons, including marriages, death without male heirs, or royal intervention. Imagine, you have just finished building your dream, invested everything you had in it, and then an official arrives with a royal decree informing you that your fortress now belongs to the crown, or that it will house a royal garrison, which you will be responsible for maintaining. And of course, no one will reimburse you for your investment. This was a constant sword of Damocles hanging over the head of any feudal lord. How then did the lords decide to incur such colossal expenses, knowing the risk? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that owning a castle, even temporarily, gave such power and prestige that the risk was justified. Or perhaps the absence of a castle made you so vulnerable that building one was a necessity, no matter what. This fact shows that medieval property was much more conditional, and the king's power was more comprehensive than we are used to thinking. Do you think a castle siege is always about storming walls and archers? What about underground battles? Medieval castles were not only above-ground structures, but also complex underground labyrinths where equally brutal wars were fought. Builders played a key role in these wars, literally digging their way to victory or death. Contrary to what is shown in movies, many castle sieges were won not by storming, but by mining or sapping. It was exhausting and extremely dangerous work that required not only physical strength, but also engineering ingenuity. The besiegers dug narrow, often low tunnels under the castle walls, trying to reach its foundations. The work was carried out in complete darkness, by torchlight, in conditions of oxygen deprivation and the constant threat of collapse. Miners used pickaxes, shovels, and simple wedges to advance, while carpenters installed wooden supports inside the tunnel to prevent it from collapsing. These supports, made of sturdy oak or elm logs, were critical to the safety of the workers. When the tunnel reached its target, the point beneath the foundation of a wall or tower, it was widened to create a so-called collapse chamber. This chamber was tightly packed with combustible materials, brushwood, straw, dry manure soaked in resin or oil. These materials were then set alight. When the supports burned down, the wall above them lost its support and collapsed, creating a breach in the fortress wall. The besiegers could then storm inside the castle through this breach. This was one of the most effective, albeit labor-intensive, tactics against stone fortresses. But the defenders did not sit idly by. They were well aware of this threat and dug their own countermines. Their goal was to intercept the enemy's tunnels before they reached the foundation. To do this, they used various methods. They listened to the ground with shields pressed against the walls or special funnels, trying to determine the direction of the enemy's tunnel. As soon as an enemy tunnel was discovered, the defenders began their own countermine. A real battle began underground. When the tunnels crossed, fierce hand-to-hand combat took place in cramped, stuffy passages, often in complete darkness, lit only by dim lamps or torches. Weapons were adapted for close combat: short swords, daggers, axes. The goal was not only to destroy the enemy, but also to destroy their tunnel. The workers who dug these tunnels were trained not only to dig, but also to fight. They were part of specialized units that could perform both engineering and combat tasks. Their risk was enormous. Collapses. The walls of the tunnels could collapse at any moment, burying the workers alive. Suffocation, smoke from torches, lack of fresh air, and sometimes the use of smoke bombs by the enemy could lead to asphyxiation. Gases. The accumulation of natural gases in enclosed spaces also posed a threat. Sudden enemy attacks. At any moment, they could encounter an enemy unit. They were a kind of underground special forces team, and their lives depended on how accurately they could calculate the tunnel's trajectory, assess the stability of the ground, and avoid capture. Master diggers were so valuable that they could be poached just like other high-end specialists. Their work was strictly classified to prevent the enemy from learning about the underground plans. Few accounts of these underground battles have survived, but every castle with deep cellars and foundations potentially hides stories of these invisible wars. Do you think anyone today would willingly take on such a job, knowing that they could be buried alive or killed in the darkness? If you want to know how castles defended themselves against such threats, watch this video to the end. We will return to the topic of sophisticated defensive systems built with genius and blood more than once. How was it possible to build a perfectly round tower or complex Gothic arches without precise measuring instruments, calculators, or computer programs? Advanced mathematics in the Middle Ages was the preserve of a few learned monks, not ordinary builders. But the accuracy of medieval structures is still impressive today. What is their secret? The answer lies not in abstract formulas, but in practical geometry and the experience and secrets of the craft, carefully passed down from generation to generation. Master masons were not theorists, but virtuoso practitioners. Their higher mathematics was embodied in simple but ingenious methods and tools. Rope and peg method. This was the basic tool for marking out large areas and determining the radii of round towers or semicircular arches. One peg was driven into the center of the future circle, and another was tied to the end of a rope. The length of the rope determined the radius. The masons simply walked around the central stake, pulling the rope taut and drawing a perfect circle on the ground or construction site. This method allowed for remarkable accuracy even on a huge scale, such as when laying out the outer line of towers. Rule 3 to 4 to 5, Pythagorean triple method. To construct perfect right angles, which is critical for straight walls, straight corridors, and room corners, a principle known as the Pythagorean triple was used. The builders did not know Pythagoras himself, but they knew that a rope divided into segments in a ratio of 3.45 units, for example, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, forms a precise right angle when formed into a triangle. This allowed them to check the angles of the foundation and walls with remarkable accuracy without using bulky and inaccurate squares over long distances. This method was so versatile that it was even used to level fields and determine boundaries. Templates and molds. For complex elements such as the ribs of Gothic arches, openwork rose window patterns, column capitals, spiral staircases, or keystones for arches, full-size wooden templates, molds were created. These templates were drawn by the master mason on his tracing floor, a special plaster floor, in actual size and then cut out by carpenters from thin boards. Freemasons then cut the stone, fitting it precisely to these wooden molds. This was work that required incredible precision and artistic flair. Many of these templates were works of art in their own right and were kept as valuable workshop secrets. Plumb bobs and levels. The simplest tools, plumb bobs and water or bubble levels, were used to check the verticality of walls and the horizontality of surfaces. Despite their simplicity, in skilled hands they provided high accuracy. Their knowledge was not just intuitive, it was the result of hundreds of years of empirical experience accumulated by generations of builders. A mistake in calculation would have meant disaster. The collapse of a wall or tower, which not only led to the loss of materials and time, but could also cost the lives of hundreds of workers and the reputation of the master. Thus, these illiterate craftsmen were geniuses of applied mathematics and physics, capable of visualizing and embodying the most complex geometric shapes in stone using only ropes, hammers, chisels, and their incredible experience. For example, the construction of concentric castles with double walls, such as Harlech Castle, required a phenomenal understanding of geometry and load-bearing capacity. Each tower and each wall had to be precisely calculated to support the weight of the upper masonry and ensure even pressure distribution. The ability to create such complex, multi-level defensive structures without modern computer models or detailed calculations is a testament to their genius. How did they achieve such precision without our modern tools? This remains a mystery that amazes modern engineers and architects, who, with all the technology in the world at their disposal, sometimes make mistakes in far less complex projects. Perhaps their secret was that they could not afford to make mistakes. Do you think a castle is just a fortress for living in defense? Where did all the lords' or kings' riches go during wartime? In the Middle Ages, there were no bank deposit boxes, and chests filled with gold and jewels were too vulnerable. Therefore, the castle itself became a giant, intricately designed safe with unexpected and often hidden treasure chambers. In addition to the obvious cellars and donjons, main towers where supplies, weapons, and wine could be stored, castles had secret rooms, hiding places, and even entire labyrinths that only a few people knew about. Their purpose was not only to store valuables, but also to hide them as much as possible from enemies, and sometimes even from their own subjects or servants. These hiding places could be extremely diverse, niches in the thickness of the walls, often bricked up or hidden behind secret doors that were disguised as part of the wall, a fireplace, or even an ordinary doorframe. The mechanisms for opening them could be extremely complex, requiring pressing hidden bricks, turning decorative elements, or using specific keys. Underground crypts and tunnels, disguised as ordinary storerooms, wells, or even toilets. Some castles had an extensive network of underground passages that could be used not only for evacuation, but also for the secret transport of valuables. These passages could lead to remote, well-hidden chambers where particularly important documents, royal regalia, jewels, or valuable coins could be stored. Well chambers. In the thickest walls of donjons or main towers, special vertical shafts could be built that descended deep underground. Valuables were lowered there on ropes, and the entrance was then carefully concealed. These chambers were extremely difficult to access, often had no obvious entrance, and were disguised as ventilation shafts or even old wells that had fallen into disuse. These hiding places were not intended for long-term storage, but rather for quick concealment during a siege, sudden attack, or threat of looting. Often, treasures were moved to the castle from royal treasuries or other safe places when danger loomed. The workers who built these hiding places were carefully selected. They were usually the most trusted craftsmen who were paid generously but required absolute secrecy. History knows many cases when, upon completion of the work, builders who knew about secret passages and hiding places were isolated, deprived of their freedom, and sometimes even killed to ensure that the secret was kept. This was not a systematic practice, but cases where craftsmen disappeared or ended up in prison after a particularly important and secret project were not uncommon. For a lord or king, keeping the location of his treasures and escape routes a secret was a matter of survival. For example, in some English castles, such as Durham Castle, there is evidence of several levels of secret passages and hidden rooms, some of which have only been discovered in recent centuries. The Tower of London, which served not only as a fortress, but also as the royal treasury and a place for storing state documents, also had numerous hiding places and chambers for particularly valuable items. Imagine you build a castle and then you are simply eliminated so that you cannot reveal the hiding place of the royal gold. Cruel? Undoubtedly. But how else could state secrets and wealth be kept safe in an era when there were no electronic codes or bank accounts, and raids and wars were commonplace? The castle was the last line of defense not only for the ruler's life, but also for his wealth and power. We have already discussed the dangers of construction, but imagine that, in addition to falling rocks and landslides, you are working side by side with an invisible enemy, death from disease. A medieval construction site was not just dangerous, it was an incubator for epidemics, and plague, dysentery, or typhus could halt construction faster than any siege. Thousands of workers, often conscripted by force, known as corvée or corvée labor, as well as hired specialists, lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions in temporary camps that sprang up like mushrooms around the walls of the castle under construction. These camps were essentially small but densely populated settlements where complete unsanitary conditions prevailed. The lack of basic sewage systems, systematic waste disposal, and adequate access to clean drinking water created ideal conditions for the spread of the most terrible infections. The constant overcrowding, poor quality food, which was often spoiled or contaminated, and vitamin deficiency, causing scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies, all severely weakened the workers' immune systems. In such conditions, even a common cold could turn into deadly pneumonia, but mass epidemics were much more dangerous. Dysentery, or bloody diarrhea, was the scourge of medieval armies and large gatherings of people. An outbreak could knock out hundreds of workers in a matter of days, dehydrating and exhausting them. Contaminated water and poor hygiene led to the rapid spread of bacteria. Typhus, epidemic and abdominal, transmitted by lice and fleas or through contaminated food and water, also decimated workers. High fever, delirium, rash, and general intoxication rendered people unable to work, and the mortality rate was very high. But undoubtedly the most terrifying visitor was the plague, or Black Death, which periodically ravaged Europe, claiming millions of lives. An outbreak of the plague on a construction site could turn a bustling site into a graveyard in a matter of weeks. Records from that time show periods when the construction of large structures, such as Westminster Abbey, which in terms of labor and time was comparable to the construction of a huge castle, came to a complete halt due to the mass death of workers. Entire teams could die out, leaving unfinished walls and piles of stone. In the 14th century, when the plague raged across Europe, many construction projects were either frozen for decades or canceled altogether due to a catastrophic labor shortage. This was not just a delay, it was a real disaster that could not be remedied. The medicine of the time was powerless against these afflictions. Doctors could only offer bloodletting, poultices, or dubious herbs that could not stop the spread of infection. The lack of understanding of the causes of disease, germs, meant that preventive measures were minimal or non-existent. Workers, weakened by hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant stress, were easy prey for any infection. Can you imagine how such monuments were built when the specter of the plague or other deadly diseases hung over you every day? It was a constant battle not only with stone and gravity, but also with an invisible army of microbes that could wipe out months and years of work at any moment. This constant threat made the work of builders even more heroic and desperate. Want to know what other diseases ravaged the builders and how this affected the appearance of the castles? Then stay tuned. We will continue to delve into the dark side of this grand era. In the Middle Ages, faith was all-encompassing. But was it faith or something more, ancient and sinister? Sometimes, during archaeological excavations, human or animal remains were found under the foundations of medieval castles. No, these were not accidental deaths of workers. These were possibly echoes of ancient building rituals that were far more sinister than we can imagine. This topic is hotly debated among historians and archaeologists. Although Christianity, the dominant religion in medieval Europe, categorically condemned human sacrifice, folk beliefs and superstitions rooted in pre-Christian, pagan times were surprisingly persistent. One such ancient and widespread idea was the concept of foundation sacrifice. According to this gruesome tradition, it was believed that sacrificing a living creature, whether an animal, horse, bull, dog, or, in extreme cases, even a human being, would strengthen a structure, give it magical protection from destruction, natural disasters, and enemy attacks, and ensure its longevity. The spirit of the victim, it was believed, became the guardian of the building. This practice was widespread in ancient times throughout the world, from Mesopotamia to South America, and did not disappear completely with the advent of Christianity. Of course, most of the human remains found under old buildings can be explained by chance. Accidents on construction sites, collapses, falls, burials of deceased workers, or simply the fact that the construction site was previously a cemetery. However, some finds raise questions because of their specific location, method of burial, or lack of signs of accidental death. For example, the discovery of skeletons walled up or placed directly under key elements of the foundation. Gates, corner towers, suggest deliberate action. Perhaps these were the remains of symbolic sacrifices, when animals were used instead of humans, or even symbolic objects associated with life, e.g., grain, tools. However, the possibility of hidden, secret human sacrifices cannot be completely ruled out. For example, Irish folklore has legends about children or even adults who were walled up in castles to ensure their inaccessibility. Such stories, although legends, may reflect echoes of ancient, forgotten practices. It is important to understand that people in the Middle Ages were extremely superstitious. Fear of evil spirits, bad luck, and curses was very strong. Clients, whether lords or even representatives of the church, could secretly resort to such rituals if they believed that this would provide their castle with additional protection. The workers who may have been involved in such activities may have been convinced of their necessity or acted under duress. This is a question that still puzzles archaeologists and historians. Each such find requires careful analysis to distinguish between chance and a possible ritual. Imagine that beneath each majestic stone lies not only the sweat and blood of the builders, but also something much darker, an echo of an ancient, terrifying belief in the power of sacrifice. Are you looking for such Easter eggs in real castles? Perhaps your next trip to an ancient fortress will take on a whole new meaning as you ponder what lies hidden beneath its foundations. In our time, information is power, and we hide it in cloud storage. But in the Middle Ages, where were all the castle's secrets, its plans, vulnerabilities, and financial reports kept? You'll be surprised, but the very masonry of the castle could be a carrier of information that could be read if you knew where to look. We're not just talking about the famous mason's marks that each stonemason carved on their blocks for accounting and identification purposes. There were also more subtle messages, changes in masonry, a sudden change in the type of stone, masonry technique, or mortar in a certain section of the wall could indicate different periods of construction, financial difficulties, or even secret passages that were built or hidden later. An experienced eye could trace the history of the castle by these seams. Use of trophy stone, the discovery of stones with distinctive markings or elements in the castle wall that clearly belonged to another destroyed building, e.g., a monastery or another castle, indicated the political or military victories of the lord who built it. This was a kind of stone trophy demonstrating his power. Symbols and heraldry, external decorative elements, heraldic shields, and sometimes hidden symbols encrypted in the masonry could reveal the lord's origins, ambitions, or even religious or occult beliefs. Thus, for those who knew the language of stone, the castle was an open book. Its entire history, from its grandeur to its downfall, from its secrets to its triumphs, was encrypted in its very structure. Could you read the history of a castle just by looking at its walls? Today, large companies spend billions on advertising and brand building. But what about in the Middle Ages? Castles were not just defensive structures. They were powerful propaganda tools. The brand of a lord or king, which literally shouted about his power, wealth, and legitimacy. You think it's just a fortress? No, it's a stone PR agency. Building a castle, especially a large and impressive one, was a public statement of power. Its size, height, quality of stone, and architectural complexity were all designed to impress and intimidate enemies. The sight of impregnable walls was supposed to discourage any desire to attack. Own subjects. The castle symbolized the protection, stability, and strength of its ruler, reinforcing his authority. Competitors. Neighboring lords, seeing the growing structure, understood who they were dealing with. Kings such as Edward I, who built a chain of castles in Wales, Carnarvon, Conwy, used them not only to control conquered territories, but also as pure PR. Carnarvon, with its unusual striped walls and polygonal towers, was meant to be associated with Constantinople and the Roman emperors, emphasizing Edward's imperial ambitions. Castles were a massive message carved in stone that was passed down from generation to generation. They were proof that the lord had enough power to assemble an army of workers, enough money to pay for the materials, and enough willpower to complete such a colossal project. Thus, a castle was not just a house or a fortress. It was a living, or rather stone, billboard of the medieval era. Which castle do you think was the most successful brand in English history? So, What have we learned about the construction of medieval castles? It was not just a construction project, it was an industrial project of the Middle Ages, which in terms of complexity, cost, and human sacrifice, could rival any modern mega-project. We saw how one brilliant master mason could keep the entire plan of a colossal structure in his head. We learned about the titanic labor involved in laying the foundations, the blood-curdling conditions of working on shaky scaffolding, the deadly alchemy of the mortar, to which bull's blood was added, and the thousands of nameless peasants whose sweat and blood became an integral part of these impregnable walls. Every stone in these castles is not just a mineral, it is evidence of superhuman perseverance, incredible ingenuity, and the monstrous price paid by ordinary people. It was a world where human life was worth less than a large block of stone, and the ambitions of rulers knew no bounds. Today we admire this architecture, but behind every fortress wall lies not only chivalrous romance, but also a harsh, sometimes cruel reality. Medieval castles are not just ruins. They are monuments to human genius and the human capacity for incredible sacrifice in pursuit of a goal. If this video has made you look at these stone giants in a new light, if you will now look at these crenellated walls differently, give it a like. And of course, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new amazing stories that will change your perception of history. Click the bell to be the first to know about our new releases. See you next time.